Melatonin isn't the only source of suppression of puberty. It's also these neural mechanisms involving GABA, but it is certainly a great candidate for one of the reasons why puberty doesn't generally tend to happen at, say, age 4 or age 5. That would be very unusual. Another component of suppression of puberty is that typically in children, they have relatively low body fat stores. Why is this important? Well, we know that one of the things that can trigger the onset of puberty, in particular in females, is that when enough body fat accumulates, that body fat releases a hormone called leptin. And that hormone leptin travels in the bloodstream across the blood-brain barrier and goes to the hypothalamus and can trigger the onset of puberty by activating the neurons that release gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So many people believe that one of the reasons that puberty is happening earlier and earlier in females is because of the accumulation of more body fat at younger ages than was observed 30 or 40 and certainly 100 years ago. Now, I can already imagine a number of people are thinking, oh, this must relate to the obesity crisis. And indeed, there is a crisis of obesity. Obesity is something that is causing all sorts of problems with people's health at various levels, brain and body, and that is far more frequent today than it was even 20 years ago. So it is indeed a crisis because it has enormous detrimental effects for so many aspects of brain and body health and longevity. But this whole process of thinking about body fat signaling leptin to the hypothalamus and the onset of puberty doesn't necessarily have to do with the obesity crisis. It might relate, but it could also relate to, for instance, improved nutrition, which is allowing body fat stores to accumulate, maybe not to the level of obesity, but to accumulate earlier and at younger ages in females, which is then causing earlier puberty in females. To just highlight how that might be possible, I want to review some data that talk about the onset of menses, menstruation, that is puberty, in females according to country and according to age over the last 100 or more years. So what are the general trends in terms of the onset of puberty in females? Well, that's an easy one to answer. Over the last 100 years or so, the onset of puberty has been occurring much earlier with each passing decade. It's really an incredible set of statistics. I will provide a link to these data since I know a number of you are listening and not just watching on YouTube. This is from a study in which the onset of puberty has been analyzed from as early as the 1850s, right? In certain countries, there are data on that, out to the 1970s, and in other countries starting at about 1900, extending out to about 1990. These are ongoing collections of data, but just to give you a sense how the data are falling out in a couple of different countries, just to give you a flavor. But for those of you listening and for those of you watching, the essence of all of these findings is that puberty is happening much, much earlier with each passing decade. So for instance, in the United States, around 1900 or 1903, the average age of menarche, the onset of puberty in females, was about 14 years old, whereas in 1990, the average age is 11. So that's a pretty significant, we could say, acceleration of the onset of puberty. Now, of course, these are averages, so there will be exceptions. There's a distribution of data. Today, still, there will be young females who will undergo puberty at age 11 or 10 or maybe even 9, and others who will undergo puberty at age 13, 14, maybe even 16 or 17. However, if we look at, for instance, the data from Norway, which dates back quite far, they have excellent record keeping, to 1850, what we see is that the average age of the onset of female puberty in 1850 in Norway was 17 years old, whereas in 1970, it's 13 years old. So this is a dramatic acceleration of the onset of puberty. And you see a similar trend in other countries as well. So if we were to look in, for instance, in the UK, they have a smaller data set, meaning it only extends back to about 1940. But the average age of the onset of puberty in the UK in 1940 was 13 and a half years old. Again, this is just for females. And in 1970, it was closer to 13 with a trend towards declining even further. Unfortunately, they didn't continue to collect data out to 2022. And as a final point, if we were to look at, for instance, in Germany and Finland, the average onset of puberty in 1870 was 16 and a half years old. By 1940, it was down to 13 and a half years old. So all of these data have borne out over and over again, regardless of location in the world, which is important because when you start to think about the obesity crisis, you could say, well, that's mainly in developed countries, believe it or not, or perhaps not surprisingly, and maybe it has to do with the obesity crisis, and yet I don't think we can conclude that at all. Something is happening, however. It could be increased body fat stores due to overeating and obesity. However, it could also be unrelated to obesity. It could be, for instance, improved nutrition and the availability of quality nutrition, which can signal the maturation of the brain and body mechanisms that trigger the onset of puberty, ovulatory cycle, and menstruation. So we want to be very careful about leaping to conclusions about what these trends mean, but the trends themselves are very, very apparent.